Hi, I'm Claire Trott from Technical Connection, and today I'm going to talk to you about the annual allowance and the different types of annual allowance that we have to deal with on a daily basis. Just a quick step back, the annual allowance was introduced in 2006, along with pension simplification and the lifetime allowance and all those lovely things we've had to deal with for the last many years, and it is many years now. Back in 2006, we only had one annual allowance and it was significant. It got all the way up, so it increased all the way up to 255,000 before the government started cutting it back, first to 50,000 and then to 40,000, which was what we have now. But we don't just have the standard lifetime allowance. We don't just have the standard annual allowance now. So we do have the annual allowance, we have the money purchase annual allowance, we have the alternative annual allowance, and then we have the tapered annual allowance. So I'm just going to go through them and just talk about the differences with them. So the standard annual allowance in theory applies to the majority of people. This is a flat rate of 40,000. For those people that don't utilise it all, then you can carry forward the unused allowances from the previous 3 years into the current tax year. So you can actually utilise that. The annual allowance itself takes account of not just personal contributions, but employer contributions and the tax relief. So anything that's going into a pension, then that will be taken account of with the standard annual allowance. I should note at this point that we're not just talking about tax relief here. We're not talking about how much you can contribute based on your earnings. So when we look at that, we need to look at how much we personally earn in order to work out what our maximum personal contributions are. And then the annual allowance takes account of everything. So as I said just a moment ago, it takes account of personal contributions, personal tax relief, and employer contributions as well. So you have to factor both of them in. So that's the standard annual allowance. We had the money purchase annual allowance brought in with the pension flexibilities, and that's designed for people who've started to access their money flexibly so they can't take money out and put money back in and get extra tax relief. That started out at 10,000 and now that's reduced down to 4,000. So anyone who's triggered the money purchase annual allowance will now have a £4,000 annual allowance. The money purchase annual allowance cannot be used for carry forward. So you either have your 4,000 and use it or you lose it. So anyone who's triggered that does that. So the triggers for the money purchase annual allowance are flexibly accessing income. So if you're taking a standard annuity, that's not flexible, although it's income, so it's not a trigger. If you're taking pension commencement lump sum, otherwise known as tax-free cash, then that's not income, so that's not a trigger. But if you're taking flexi access drawdown payments, then that is a flexible income. Or if you're taking UF+, at least part of that is a flexible income. Even though it's paid as a lump sum, it's taxed as income. So that will be a trigger. For those people who happen to still be in capped drawdown, that's not a trigger. But if they move over to flexi access and take income, then that will trigger the money purchase annual allowance. Once you're in as well. There's no getting back out of it. So it's important for those people who are going to trigger the money purchase annual allowance to consider the timing of contributions. So for example, you've got somebody who's paying into a pension and they're going to start taking income shortly. If they need to consider if they're going to continue making contributions, what the contributions are in the rest of the tax year. So for example, someone could quite happily pay in £20,000 into their pension before they trigger the money purchase annual allowance, but for the rest of the tax year, they can't pay any more than £4,000 without getting an annual allowance charge. So the next thing to consider, and this is in association with the money purchase annual allowance, is the alternative annual allowance. So basically all that is for those people who are in a defined benefit scheme and they're accruing benefits still, then that doesn't trigger the money purchase annual allowance. But if they are accruing benefits, then they have the rest of the 40,000 available. Or all of the 40,000 if they're not making any money purchase contributions under the alternative. So as a bare minimum, it's 36,000, but they can utilise the whole 40 if they're only making contributions or if they're only accruing benefits under the defined benefit scheme. The last one, and the most complicated one, is the tapered annual allowance. I'm not going to go into all the details here. We have videos on the tapered annual allowance and how that works. But the bare basics of that is if someone is within the tapered annual allowance, they're going to have an annual allowance of somewhere between 4,000 and 40,000. And it is triggered by their earnings. And it's not the same calculation for earnings as you would look for pension contributions, for example, because pension contributions, we only consider earned income. But when we're looking at how much somebody earns, when we're looking at the tapered annual allowance, then what we need to do is take into account pretty much everything that's subject to income tax. So that could be rental income, savings income, dividend income, all of those need to be factored in. And the two numbers you need to be mindful of is the threshold income, which is 200,000, and the adjusted income, which is 240,000. So you need earnings over the threshold to get you into the calculations. And then anything, your earnings, if when taken into account on the adjusted income, are over 240, that's when the annual allowance starts to reduce, all the way up to a threshold income of 312, at which point your annual allowance is reduced to 4,000. You can still utilise carry forward when you're in the tapered annual allowance. So you may have years when you're not tapered, you may have years when you are tapered, and it's working out each time in each tax year what the taper is, and then you can carry forward the unused residual of that into the current tax year, again from the previous 3 tax years. So as you can see, the annual allowance may seem simple. It was, I have to say, back in the day, back in 2006, very easy to calculate, and most people weren't anywhere near it. Now the annual allowance much more complicated and much more difficult for people to necessarily navigate on their own. So the value of advice here is really key. So we start with the annual allowance. What can we do with our annual allowance? And then you go on to the next stage, which I've talked about previously, is how much tax relief can I personally get on my personal contributions? Thank you.